This video couldn't have been made without Squarespace. In the midst of World War II, an ambitious new fighter prototype took shape far from the front lines, which looked like nothing you'd ever seen. With its sleek blended wing design and radical features, it looked like something out of a comic or a science fiction movie. Thus, the nickname Bat, or Moonbat, was more than appropriate. Heck, if Batman needed a plane in the 1940s, this would have been his ride. But the story of the XP-67 is no superhero tale. It's a drama of engineering dreams and nightmarish realities. So let's explore how the Moonbat came to be, why it captured interest, how it faltered in testing, and ultimately why it never entered service, even though it could have been the next step in aircraft evolution. The XP-67's journey began with a bold challenge from the US Army Air Corps in the early 1940s. The military issued a request for proposal R-40C, calling for a new kind of fighter interceptor that could do what no other fighter had done. It demanded an aircraft with unprecedented performance, a bomber-destroyer that could climb fast, sprint far, and hit hard. And they weren't afraid to encourage radical thinking. In fact, they explicitly wanted revolutionary ideas, even if that meant taking risks with unorthodox designs. At the time, James McDonnell was an experienced designer with big dreams of designing cutting-edge airplanes. The R-40C proposal was his golden opportunity for him and his young company to step into the big leagues. McDonnell's team jumped into action, brainstorming an aircraft that could meet the R-40C requirements. Their first concept that they came up with, called Model 1, was pretty unconventional. It envisioned a sleek mid-wing aircraft with aerodynamic fillets, blending the wing roots into the fuselage for a smooth outline. Uniquely, Model 1 was to be powered by a single engine buried deep in the fuselage that would drive a pair of pusher propellers, one on each wing, via long shafts and right-angle gearboxes. This configuration aimed to reduce drag because there was no big engine sticking out of the nose, and still provide the power of two props. It was an audacious design that looked like it came from the future. However, when the military evaluated Model 1 alongside 22 other proposals, McDonnell's radical idea failed to shine. It ranked 21st out of 23. Why? Well, its projected performance was as impressive on paper as some rivals, and its old propulsion was unproven and likely a maintenance nightmare. Instead, they selected a few other proposals to pursue. McDonnell's dream seemed to have grounded before takeoff. Yet, in that setback lay a little glimmer of hope. The higher-ups saw promise in McDonnell's approach, or rather, the ingenuity in the blended aerodynamics, so instead of dismissing this newcomer entirely, they offered McDonnell a small contract of $3,000 to refine the design. It was basically a paid chance to try again. By mid-1940, Model 2 was put forward, and then quickly updated to Model 2A by April 1941 after further refinements. This time, the design abandoned the complicated single-engine scheme. Model 2A featured a more conventional engine layout with two engines, each in its own streamlined nacelle extending from the wing's leading edge, and with standard tractor propellers. While the twin-engine setup was usual, almost everything else about the Model 2A was quite unusual. The aircraft's shape remained an aerodynamicist's fever dream, with the fuselage maintaining a true airfoil cross-section, effectively turning the center of the airplane into a lifting body. The engine nacelles were blended so thoroughly into the wing structure that the wings and engines appeared as one continuous piece. Every edge and junction was filleted or smoothed to avoid sharp corners where drag could start. The design made heavy use of laminar flow airfoil profiles for both wing and fuselage surfaces, aiming to keep the airflow smooth and slick across much of the aeroplane as possible. In theory, this would reduce the drag dramatically and allow higher speeds. Interestingly, due to the filleting that we've mentioned, the first nickname of the XP-67 was not Bat, but rather Flying Fillet, which is what the Army test pilots called it in the reports. McDonnell's predictions for performance were eye-opening. They claimed their now refined interceptor could reach about 472 miles per hour. That's 760 kilometers per hour at altitude. To put that in perspective, in 1941, no operational fighter in the world could even reach 440 miles per hour. So this new plane would be a rocket. They also expected it could fly long and climb high. The design's weight was also estimated around 18,500 pounds. But this was to be a big, powerful brute of a fighter made to hunt bombers. The Army Air Force decided the Model 2A was worth a shot, and on September 30th, 1941, they officially named the project as the XP-67 and awarded McDonnell a contract to build 2 prototypes. For McDonnell Aircraft, which had never actually built an aircraft before, this contract was a huge breakthrough. The company now had to turn those futuristic blueprints into reality and proved that this insane comic book design could fly and fight. As detailed engineering continued into 1942, the XP-67's design matured and it took on a distinctive feature that made it unlike any other aeroplane of its era. From a distance, the XP-67 looked almost like a giant bat or a manta ray, which is why it gained the unofficial nickname Bat or Moonbat, which is now stuck until today. Its silhouette was wide and flattened, the nose was pointed and stretched smoothly into the wing roots, and the tail was set atop the fuselage in a way to keep it clear of the wing wake. If one squinted their eyes, it appeared as if the wings and body were all one continuous piece, because essentially they were. This was one of the earliest attempts to create what we now call a blended wing body in a fighter aircraft. To fulfill its bomber-killing mission, the XP-67 was designed to carry an unprecedented armament for a fighter. Initial ideas ranged from multiple machine guns to a combination of cannons. At one point, the team even toyed with the idea of a massive 75mm cannon mounted in the nose, an idea soon deemed impractical unless they wanted to also blast the plane backwards with recoil. Interestingly, the Germans did exactly this with their HS-129B3, but that was meant for tank hunting, not bomber hunting. Eventually, the armament plan settled on 6 37mm M4 cannons mounted in the nose section, and boy, let me tell you, this would have packed an extraordinary punch. The production version of the Moonbat was intended to also include a pressurized cockpit. This would have allowed the pilot to fly comfortably at high altitude without an oxygen mask and heavy cold weather gear. All of these features made the Moonbat arguably one of the most technologically ambitious piston engine aircraft projects of World War II, and in theory, it would fly higher, faster, and further and hit harder than almost anything in the sky, especially compared to the Germans. However, every one of those innovations came with a cost and complexity, and McDonnell engineers were essentially trying to push the envelope in multiple dimensions at once. Whilst they had the confidence and perhaps a bit of that youthful daring of a new company eager to make its mark, this would certainly be a challenge. As 1942 turned into 43, the XP-67 was moving from design boards to the workshop floor. And by floor, that's what they also discovered. The XP-67 Moonbat was a wildly futuristic World War II prototype whose influence can still be seen in today's fighter jets. Its sleek, blended wing body design pioneered aerodynamic shaping techniques later used in stealth aircraft like the B-2 and F-22 Raptor. Our aircraft today are built on the shoulders of giants like those who worked on the XP-67, and we wouldn't dream of making an aircraft without using the design expertise that came before. So why would your website be any different? Introducing the brand new Squarespace website creator that combines 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise with their own cutting-edge AI technology to give you your strongest creative potential yet. With Squarespace, it will actually recommend a fantastic design to reach your goals, which is a more personalized website, and it will never look like a template again. But that's not all, because building a website is only the beginning, because with Squarespace you can also run email campaigns and educational courses, and believe it or not, I actually use Squarespace to run my online merch store for Found and Explained, which you can visit down with the link in the bottom. But if you want a website for yourself and you want to get 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain, head to www.squarespace.com/found and join me with a Squarespace website. Constructing the XP-67 prototype proved to be a learning experience filled with challenges. One of the first major tasks was creating the full-scale mock-up, and by April of 1942, McDonnell had this ready for the Army to review. The mock-up revealed just how snug everything had to be. The engines, turbos, cooling ducts, guns, landing gear, etc. all had to fit into this very slim, aerodynamically constrained shape. It was like trying to fit a V12 engine and all of its accessories into a sports car body that normally held a V8, and then doing that twice, plus guns and a pilot. They got the nod to proceed, but when actual construction of the flying prototype began, McDonnell's workforce faced more technical hurdles. But by the end of 1943, McDonnell had poured considerable sweat and treasure into the XP-67, and finally the first prototype was nearly complete. But this didn't go unnoticed by the US Army, who were concerned about the persistent delays and ballooning costs, and they decided in October of 1943 to stop work on the second prototype entirely. So all the focus went to finishing and testing the first machine. So when people say only one XP-67 was built, that's true because the second one was never finished and was effectively cancelled before it could even complicate things further. Yikes. Just before Christmas in December of 1943, the first XP-67 prototype was finally rolled out. It was impressive, a futuristic-looking plane painted in a wartime olive drab and grey with its wide wings and pointed nose. It certainly didn't look like any Thunderbolt or Lightning or Mustang or anything else the US Army had ever seen. The team was eager to see it fly, but first came the cautious steps of ground testing, a phase that would reveal that the Moonbat had some nasty surprises under the hood. Ground testing began in early December 1943 in St. Louis. This included an engine run-up and taxi tests, and almost immediately trouble started. During the high-speed taxi test run on December 8, 1943, with the engines at near full throttle, the XP-67 suddenly experienced fires in both of the engine nacelles. The culprit was traced to an exhaust system, but for a brand new airplane, having simultaneous fires on both sides of the ground was a bad sign. Fortunately, the fires were extinguished and the aircraft was saved, but the damage took weeks to repair. Flash forward to early January 1944 and the XP-67 was patched up and deemed ready for flight. The honour of the first flight went to McDonnell's test pilot Everett Ed Elliott, and honestly, this guy could be the hero of our story as much as the Moonbat itself, and soon you'll understand why. On January 6, 1943, with Elliott at the controls, the XP-67 roared down the runway and lifted off for the first time. For a few glorious minutes, the Moonbat was airborne, streaking over the countryside, but that maiden flight was cut short after only 6 minutes. Elliott had to declare an emergency and bring the XP-67 down promptly because the engines were overheating badly. Those pesky cooling ducts that had caused troubles the first time hadn't done their job well enough again. The Moonbat's first landing was safely accomplished, but it was clear that the aircraft was sick and needed more tinkering. Over the next days and weeks, the McDonnell crew worked hard to improve the cooling and reliability of the airframe. With the second and third flights of the XP-67 later in the same month, thankfully uneventful in terms of emergencies. The fixes seemed to reduce the immediate overheating threat, and during these flights, basic handling was evaluated and the initial pilot's impressions gathered. It's worth noting that in a steady level flight and moderate maneuvers, the XP-67 actually handled quite nicely. The controls were responsive and the blended wing design wasn't prone to any obvious quirks, and flying a routine flight was pretty stable. There were hopes that once the cooling issues were fixed, the Moonbat would start showing its true potential, but fate had other plans. On the fourth flight, the engines began to overspeed, meaning they revved beyond their safe limit, likely due to a propeller governor malfunctioning or a throttle linkage issue. In those seconds of over-revving, the finely tuned engines essentially tore themselves apart internally. Elliott suddenly had 2 failing engines. He managed to throttle back and head back to base as both engines lost power. To add more to the drama, the canopy of the aircraft flew off during the bombing return, but miraculously Elliott brought the XP-67 in for a safe landing, even though both engines were now wrecked and the airplane had to be repaired yet again. I'm telling you, this guy's a hero. The team would install a fresh pair of Continental XI-1430 engines, which were essentially advanced liquid-cooled V12s that were very much experimental, and they made further modifications, but then came another frustrating delay. The newly installed engines apparently did not perform as they should. Possibly due to rushed assembly or lingering design flaws, the new engines were underpowered or had reliability issues from the get-go. Test flights were put on pause until these power plants could be sorted out. And at this stage, some of the Army Air Forces started shaking their heads. On March 23rd, flight tests were resumed, and by May 1944, with things relatively smoothed out, the Army Air Force sent out their own test pilots to formally evaluate the XP-67. On May 11th, the Army pilot put the Moonbat to the test. His feedback echoed what McDonnell's team already knew. The aircraft was still underpowered and sluggish in acceleration and climb. Takeoff required a long runway, and initial climb was very shallow. If one engine failed, it would be a very dicey situation to keep it flying. The cockpit and systems got a thumbs up for being reasonable and overcomplicated, but that was a small win. In terms of raw numbers, they recorded a top speed around 405 miles per hour at altitude, far short of the 472 miles per hour goal. This was in part due to the weight that kept increasing because of all the fixes and reinforcements. And keep in mind that this was still without the heavy autocannons installed, so even 405 miles per hour was the best case scenario. It was apparent that, despite some positive qualities, the XP-67 was not going to set any performance records. In fact, it was inferior in many respects to fighters already in operational squadrons fighting in Europe and the Pacific. Again, for context, the P-51D Mustang by mid-1944 could hit around 440 miles per hour with emergency power. It had an excellent climb rate and was a proven dogfighter. The XP-67 was slower, couldn't climb well, and hadn't even been tested in combat-like scenarios due to caution over its quirks. The grand vision of a super interceptor had collided with reality. By late summer of 1944, the XP-67 prototype had logged somewhere around 42 to 43 hours of total flight time. But that's not a lot, but enough to reach a verdict. Still, the program hadn't been explicitly cancelled yet, so McDonnell planned to keep testing as long as they were allowed and maybe salvage something, or at least finish the evaluations. And then came that fateful September day. On September 6, 1944, during a routine test flight, the XP-67's engine caught fire in mid-air. How surprising. This was essentially a repeat of the type of incident that occurred on the ground earlier, but far more dangerous since now it was in the sky. Ed Elliott reacted swiftly with this life-threatening situation, and for a moment, it seemed like the Moonbat might survive this ordeal. Elliott brought it down to the runway at Lambert Field, and the plane touched down safely, even with the flames spewing from the engines. His plan to save the aircraft was to position it facing down the wind. That way, the breeze would blow the fire and smoke forward, away from the rest of the plane until firefighters could arrive. It was quick thinking, and it might have worked, except for one final twist of fate. As Elliott tried to pivot the plane into the wind after landing, the right side brake failed, and the aircraft could not be turned as intended with the fire spreading quickly. Elliott evacuated the cockpit and ran away, joining the crash crew who could only watch from a safe distance as the Moonbat was consumed by the flames. By the time the fire was out, the XP-67 prototype was a charred hulk. This dramatic inferno was sadly a very symbolic end for the Moonbat project, a project that had been plagued by fire and heat issues from the start. After the smoking ruins of the prototype cooled, there was essentially nothing left to do but write reports and close the books. With only the flying prototype gone and the second one incomplete, the US Army Air Forces saw no justification to continue. A week later, they formally pulled the plug on the XP-67 program. And for McDonnell Aircraft, this must have been a bitter pill. They had invested a lot of their reputation, sweat and tears into the Moonbat program. But to the company's credit, they had other prospects. Notably, they had been doing some jet engine research and were in talks with the Navy about a jet fighter, which would become the FH Phantom. So McDonnell wasn't done as a company by any means. They were simply moving on from their first big disappointment. And history would prove that in the best way possible, with McDonnell Douglas becoming the brain behind probably the best modern fighter ever made, the F-15. Sometimes, timing is everything. Had the XP-67 flown earlier in 1943 and worked out its bugs quicker, perhaps it could have been refined into a decent, if not record-breaking aircraft by late 1944. By the time it was flying somewhat okay, it was already obsolete. Today, no Moonbat survives, obviously, with only pieces and photographs to remain in archives, and little YouTube videos like this one. But you know what? We actually love projects like that because that means we can revive these aircrafts in 3D and show you what could have been. The XP-67 is a reminder of a time when an aircraft could be called a bat and actually look the part, when ambition outpaced technology, and when even unrealized dreams helped pave the way for future triumphs. Thank you so much for watching, and let me know what you'd like to see on the channel in the future.